15. The fruits of struggle. How can Republican institutions, free schools, free churches, free social intercourse, exist in a mingled community of nabobs and serfs, of the owners of 20,000-acre manors with lordly palaces and the occupants of narrow huts inhabited by low white trash? If the South is ever to be made a safe republic, let her land be cultivated by the toil of the owners. This country will be well rid of the free labor of intelligent citizens, of the proud, bloated, and defiant rebels. The foundations of their institutions must be broken up and relayed, or all our blood and treasure have been spent in vain. Thaddeus Stevens at Lancaster, Pennsylvania, 1865. March came in cold and clear. The sun moved in brilliant splendor across a cloudless sky but cast so little heat upon the earth that it did not even begin to melt the light mantle of snow that had fallen in the night. The glistening snow miraculously transformed the dusty, crumbling, adobe village and turned it into a fairyland of black and white, as pure and clean as the day the world was born. In the reflected brightness of the open street that ran past the gate of South Temple stood two militiamen. As they shummed their benumbed cloth-shod feet and blew on their frostbitten fingers, an impatient crowd of peasants in tattered winter garments, frayed shoes, patched shawls, and worn-out quilts grew in size before them. Behind the massive wooden gates of the temple yard a dozen other militiamen ran to and fro, called to each other, carried out goods, led livestock back and forth, placed furniture in rows, and dumped clothes in neat piles as if preparing for a fair. As a result of these efforts, the ancient temple, with its heavy wooden columns and upturned tile roof, was soon surrounded by what amounted to a veritable exhibition of domestic artifacts, agricultural implements, and animal husbandry. On the street side of the yard stood the restless livestock section, its prime exhibit a yellow bullock with manure-caked flanks. Beside him stood a black mule, brushed until it glistened and decorated with strands of red yarn woven into its mane and forelock. Underfoot, tied by one hind leg, was a black sow, her dry. 147. Shapeless teats dragging in the snow. Beside her romped two fat piglets from her fall litter. Close by, in a woven bamboo basket, crouched a dozen chickens, their feathers bright with all the colors of the rainbow. 6 long-haired sheep bawed and milled about in a flimsy stockade of Kalyong stalks. On the right, behind the livestock, the farm implements were lined up. They included a large 2-wheeled cart with iron-rimmed wheels, a wooden plow with an iron-tipped point, a harrow made of woven wattles for heavy mattock-like hoes, a dozen 3-pronged wooden pitchforks made from tree limbs that branched 3 ways, wooden shovels, rakes, cedars, manure buckets, a winch rope and a winch for raising water from a well, and many other useful things too numerous to mention. To the left stood the great crocks, jars, and tightly woven baskets that the gentry used for storing their grain. There were also reed mats that could be made into field shelters, storage bins, or sleeping covers for a kayong. In the very center of the yard, tastefully arranged, were several finely shaped yet sturdy hardwood chairs and stools. Behind them stood tables, dressers, sideboards, and carved chests of cherry and mahogany, the latter fitted with massive brass corner guards and locks. Here also were displayed 3 large mirrors, one of full-length glass free from a single blemish. On the tables and on boards laid across wooden horses sat dozens of household implements, a loom, several spinning wheels, reels for winding cotton yarn, round-bottomed iron pots, bamboo baskets for steaming bread, and a stout press for forcing specially treated cornmeal through holes in a steel plate to form corn noodles. Here also were needles, shuttles, a strong bow for fluffing cotton, and a flour sifter made of very fine mesh copper screen that was worth its weight in gold. Other makeshift tables, closer still to the temple steps, were laden with clothes of all shapes, sizes, colors, and styles, from crude homespun work cottons to silk gowns and satin caps, embroidered undergarments, embroidered slippers, silk handkerchiefs, and kerchiefs of lace. 3 great fleece-lined gowns for men lay at one end of the central table, and beside them several silk-padded undertunics highly prized for winter wear. Here also were babies' caps with silken dragon's jaws and ears sewn on, a silver rattle, several silver bracelets, some earrings and other jeweled ornaments, bolts of machine-made cloth, odd bits of cotton, dyed and undyed, sleeve protectors for women who cooked. 2 alarm clocks, a chest full of rags useful for making shoe soles, and a whole table full of shoes, new and old, large and small, from satin shoes for the exquisite bound feet of a bride to coarse cotton and hemp work shoes already half worn through in the sole. Another whole table was piled high with cotton and silk quilts of every bright color, flowered, striped, and plain. Here on display was the whole domestic and agricultural wealth of several prosperous gentry families, all of which had been transformed by bitter struggle into fruits belonging to the people. Every item had been carefully recorded by a committee of poor peasants whose members, at that very moment, sat conferring at a table on the raised platform of the temple. Before them were scrolls of paper many feet in length, rolled up for convenience on round wooden sticks. On these scrolls, in black grass characters, were written the name and value in millet of every article in the yard. Several young peasants who knew how to write, even if it was only by means of a brand of phonetic shorthand that would have shocked a true scholar, were busy trimming their writing brushes and rubbing their ink tablets in water in preparation for recordino the decisions of the crowd that now filled the street, growing noisier with each interval of delay. Finally everything was ready. The militiamen on the outside threw open the gates. People poured through waving in their hands the papers that showed they had been chosen, because of extreme poverty or proved grievances, for the privilege of first choice. The militiamen turned back all those without a paper and, after about 50 people had gone in, shut the gates entirely. The bustle that had characterized the preparations in the temple gave way to pandemonium as the excited peasants surrode from table to table, from display to display. Large items such as the farm cart, the bullock, and the mule had already been allocated by the committee. The men of the households that were to share the animals gathered round to look them over, push, feel, examine, and discuss them. It seemed that they would never tire of leading the animals up and down, holding their mouths open to judge their age, patting their flanks, or just standing back to admire their shapes. These were the first livestock many of them had ever owned. Even if each individual share was one leg, they were proud that leg was so sound. While these lucky few looked over the livestock and the cart, the rest of the men and women, with all the enthusiasm of a crowd of country people at a big city fair, made the rounds of the courtyard, turned piles of clothes inside out and upside down, tried on gowns for size, paraded with silk tunics held up in front of them, put on the one large wolfskin hat and gesticulated with it before the full length. Grass characters are ideographs written freestyle by hand as contrasted to ideographs blocked out in square form and printed. Mirror. They spread out quilts, felt the texture of bolts of cloth, seated themselves in chairs, tested tables for steadiness, and all the while called to each other, joked, laughed, and carried on in the highest of spirits. Never since the world began had there been a day like this. Each peasant had the right to choose one item. Before making a final decision, all wanted plenty of time to look over the goods that were there, yet all hesitated to delay too long lest they lose their heart's desire to some more decisive soul. Before many minutes had passed, first one and then several more had made up their minds. With their chosen articles in hand, they walked up to the steps of the temple and showed the committee what they proposed to carry home. "Are you sure that's what you want?" asked Fanshen, the most skillful writer in the whole village, of old Tuachin the bachelor, who balanced on his shoulder a baked clay jar almost as large as himself. Said the old man cockily. "I haven't anything at all, that's it, for my grain never had that much grain before. This is just the thing." After some searching through the lists, Fanshen found the crock on the scroll where it was catalogued along with other storage items and entered Tuachin's name alongside it. "It's listed at 50 caddies," he said, a note of doubt in his voice. Said old Tuachin. "It's worth all if that's all right with me, that." Tuachin was given a slip of paper listing the item and its price. This he handed to the militiaman as he went out the gate. As he trudged home, he greeted all he met on the street with a broad grin. "Fanshen lo ma?" asked several. Replied "Fan luai kukayongshin, tue chin," pointing to the huge jar and laughing heartily at his own pun. To turn an empty body meant to get nothing in the Fanshen movement. Others did not find what they wanted as easily as old Tue Chin. Or if they did, they were not alone in their choice. Two old women decided at the same time on one flowered quilt. They fell to quarreling over it and ended up in a tug-of-war, each pulling the quilt to her with all her might while shouting oaths and insults at the other at the top of her voice. Cheno Keyuan, the chairman of the Peasants' Association, who was supervising the clerks at the table, had to rush down and step between them. "If you fight that way, you'll tear the quilt in half and no one will have it," he admonished good-humoredly. "Now tell me, why do you both want that one?" Both women started talking at once, but Chen Keyuan, who knew them well, hardly needed to listen. He decided that the quilt should go to the one with the largest family. He advised the loser to pick out a different quilt. "After all," he said, "there are plenty more, even if this one is the best." In less time than it took to cook a noon meal over a straw fire, the courtyard began to empty out, and soon thereafter in every lane and alley peasants could be seen trudging homeward with their newly acquired possessions. As soon as the first group had cleared the gate, the call went out for the second, the representatives of households just a little better off, who were to get second choice. Most of them had already been waiting their turn for Iono time. When the gate was opened, they rushed in as eagerly as their poorest neighbors had done earlier. And so it went all morning and all afternoon until the snow in the temple yard had all been trampled into the dirt and the whole area took on once again an ancient, dilapidated look that matched the growing disarray of the much-handled goods on the tables and the ground. Before night fell, the last peasants had made their selections and carried or carted them away. Still, there were quite a few things left behind. The militiamen, who had been on duty since before dawn and now had to clean up, decided that each of them had earned the right to pick out something and, though it was not strictly legal, each man set aside a small article before carrying the remaining wealth back to the storehouse. Such was a typical distribution in the course of the settling accounts movement. The system described above was arrived at only after much trial and error, many meetings of the cadres and the officers of the Peasants' Association, and several county-wide conferences at which the experiences of many villagers were pooled. When the first confiscated property was distributed in Longbao, it was handed out not according to need but according to the grievances expressed at the meetings. This was done under the slogan Shui Tu, Shui Fen, he who struggles gets a share. This was logical at the time and based on a rough measure of justice. Those who had been robbed and cheated should have their property restored, those who had been exploited most heavily should get supplementary wages and benefits. Also, since many did not yet dare attack the gentry for fear of reprisal, those who dared accuse should be rewarded. The actual distribution of property based on openly made accusa. Tie-ins had a tremendous impact. People said, "Now we have proof that the Eighth Root Army really backs the poor. They take action and are not satisfied with empty talk. Yin's troops talked well but cared nothing for us. They only seized our property and dragged us off to the front." When they saw that active struggle actually paid off in land, houses, clothes, and grain, more people joined each succeedance movement. But even so, after several distributions it became clear that the more active peasants, the brave and the vocal, were getting more than their fair share of the fruits, while many a poor family that had suffered as much if not more, and needed land and chattels as much if not more, went without. It thus became obvious that active participation alone could not be the only criterion. Distribution on the basis of need had to be introduced. To handle such distribution, the Peasants' Association set up a special committee of 60 It was composed of the village cadres, the elected leaders of the Peasants' Association, and delegates elected by the working peasants of each village neighborhood. Where land was concerned, the task of fair distribution was not too difficult. Since the village as a whole possessed approximately an acre of land per capita, those families who had less than the average were given enough to make up the difference. Complications that arose by virtue of the fact that the plots varied in fertility and that all plots were not equally close to the peasants' homes were adjusted by painstaking calculation and juggling until most families were satisfied. The redistribution of housing was handled in the same way. The village as a whole had less than a section of house per capita. Families without this average were given additional sections wherever possible. Here complicating factors were personal prejudice. Some families would not share a courtyard with others whom they disliked, and the location of privies and wells. Privies were vital to every family's economy. They were also very expensive to construct. They were deep, stone-lined cisterns large enough to hold all the solid and liquid excrement of a large family for a whole year. From them came the night soil, in semi-liquid form, on which almost the entire yield of the land was based. Since there were not enough privies to go around, families had to share them. If the families were on good terms, the sharing went well. If not, endless quarrels ensued. As for wells, no one expected that every family should own one, but it was important that no one should have to walk too far for water. Judicious allocation of housing sections solved this problem in the main. Draft animals and carts were even scarcer than privies and wells. Since there were only 50 animals in the whole village and since no animals owned by working peasants could be expropriated, the available animals had to be shared. It was common to allocate one ox to as many as 4 families, each of which thus became the proud possessor of a leg. This led to quarrels, but it also solved problems. At least those with one leg were better off than those who had none, for even when the draft animals were shared 4, 6 and in some cases even 10 ways, there were still not enough to go around. Carts were distributed in about the same proportion as the livestock. The headaches encountered by the distribution committee in dividing land, houses, and stock were as nothing compared to those encountered in redistributing the miscellaneous property in a way to satisfy everyone. The village cadres and the delegates to the committee met for days on end to evaluate fairly all expropriated property in terms of millet, the standard grain, and to set up a system of grades which would properly classify all families on the basis of need. Various systems for making everything come out even were adopted, but in the end the most successful was a system that combined the direct adjustment of grievances with extra aid for the poorest and most needy. The system worked as follows: the total value of all the goods available, grain plus household articles, tools, implements, and livestock, was first figured as a grain equivalent. Then every family was put in a grade based on need. Those families who had serious grievances against a landlord or rich peasant also had the value of the damage due them figured as a grain equivalent. If the family was already comparatively well off and therefore in a high grade, its damages were then reduced by a certain percentage. For example, a grievance worth 100 weight of millet might be cut back to 70 pounds if the family had most of the things needed for carrying on production. The grain left over after the serious grievances were accounted for was then allocated to all the rest of the families based on their grade. As a result of all this figuring, each family was entitled to take home a certain amount of grain or its equivalent in other forms of property. When an article was chosen, its value was deducted from the total grain allowance for that family. The balance, if any, was paid in grain should the article chosen amount to more value than the grain allotted to them. The family had to pay the difference in money or grain according to the same scale. This was a very complex system. But so too was the problem. Since the movement had a dual purpose, the rewards had to be based on a dual principle: repayment for past injuries and damages. and the Fanshen or economic turnover of every family in the village. That it worked at all was due to a very definite measure of correlation between the grievances and the poverty of the families that made them. It was those who had suffered the most who made the most charges in the long run and at the same time needed the most to put them on a par with the rest of the village. In order to ensure that no one should take advantage of his or her newly won power, the village cadres and militiamen did not share in the first few distributions. Wait until the people see that you are getting nothing and they themselves suggest that you should get a share, was the advice given to Fuyuan and Tianming by district leader Liang. But although the cadres were patient and waited unselfishly, no one suggested that they also should benefit from the struggle. Many militiamen decided that it was better to be a common peasant than a leading activist and asked to be mustered out. This brought the matter to a head and it was decided that everyone should be put in a grade according to his economic position and that everyone, cadres, militia, and ordinary citizens, should share and share alike. At the same time, in recognition of the special burden borne by the militiamen, a certain amount of property was turned over to the Corps for the benefit of that organization as a whole. This property included several acres of wheat land that had belonged to the collaborator Wang Xiaonan. The militia harvested the wheat and used a portion of the harvest plus some millet from a later distribution to set up a little shop where cigarettes and other articles of daily use were sold. There the militiamen doing guard duty at night could gather for a cup of hot water and a chat. The little shop became a sort of militiamen's club. The militia corps was the first but not the only organized body to receive fruits for common use. The Peasants' Association took over the Western Inn from the Fan family and invested several hundredweight of expropriated grain as operating capital. Wang Yulai, vice chairman of the association, managed the inn and managed it so well that its capital increased several-fold in 1 year. From its profits came funds for the village school, oil for the lamps used at public meetings, and other incidental village expenses. The Western Inn grew into the same sort of center for the cadres that the little shop had become for the militia. Cadres gathered there for meetings, for figuring up accounts, and for pleasure. As a result, many a free meal was eaten there in the course of the next 2 years, an incipient form of corruption that boded no good for the future. The 2 confiscated distilleries also became public property. They were turned over to the border region government liquor monopoly and operated thereafter as part of a wide network of publicly owned distilleries, the revenue of which helped in great measure to finance the cost of the liberated area's government and the military effort necessary to defend it. Certain other fruits of struggle were turned over to the distilleries to help them maintain production. Other fruits were given to the consumer cooperative to put it on its feet. Most important among the latter were a cart and a mule which the co-op used to haul supplies. By the middle of March, when all the fruits had been distributed, the landless and land poor found themselves living in an entirely new world. 242 acres of land had been allocated to the families in this group, thereby doubling the acreage in their possession. Their holdings had jumped from an average of 44 acres per capita to an average of 83 acres per capita. This amount of land did not make them wealthy by any means, but it was sufficient to maintain a minimum standard of living. It meant that they had moved from the ragged edge of starvation into relative security. Peasants who formerly grew only half enough to live on and had to work out or rent land for the remainder of their subsistence suddenly became peasants who could raise enough to live on their own land. What was true of land was also true of other means of production. Families who had not possessed adequate shelter, draft animals, implements, and seed grain became families who owned all these things in sufficient quantity to maintain life. This happened not to just a few individuals but to more than half the population of the village. 140 families with 517 members turned over economically in the course of this movement. The impact of this shift on the outlook and morale of the landless and land poor was tremendous. For the first time in their lives, they felt some measure of control over their destiny. They slept under their own roofs, walked on their own land, planted their own seed, looked forward to harvesting their own crops and, what was perhaps best of all, owed neither grain nor money to any man. They were completely free of debt. Shen Fa Liang, the former hired laborer in Shen's Chinoho's household, said, "Life is much better than before. Now I have land and house and work to do. There is grain in my house. I work very hard, but I enjoy the results of my work because I carry all the results of my work back home and put it in my own jars." But in the past it was just the opposite. I labored very hard regardless of rain or shine, but all that work was for others, not for me. All the crops were very beautiful, but all the crops I had to carry to someone else's granary. I couldn't even see them anymore, not to mention eating them. So in the past I worked for others. Now I work for myself and no longer suffer the painful life, the unhappy life of working for others. Chen Lai's wife felt the same way. In the old days I worked as a servant, I was busy every night until midnight, and I had to get up before dawn. Now I am very busy too, but now I work for myself. This is happy labor. No one oppresses me and the money that I earn is my own. My condition now is good. I've got house, land to till, clothes to wear, and the right to speak. Who dared speak before? In the past when I served in other families, even when they didn't beat or curse me, still, if I committed some trifling error their eyebrows and their eyes met. It is hard to eat with another's bowl. To live in one's own house and eat out of one's own bowl is the happiest life. Wu Qiui's wife, a woman who had been forced to sell her son and who had been sold twice herself, summed up her feelings in one sentence: "It seems as if I have moved from hell to heaven." Such feelings, when multiplied by 500, made for an atmosphere of extraordinary elation that soon changed even the everyday vocabulary of the village. The peasants all began to call one another comrade after the custom of the Eighth Route Army, and in place of the age-old greeting, "Countryman, have you eaten?" Many poor peasants asked one another, "Comrade, have you turned over?" To that question a large number could already answer, "I have turned." The use of the word comrade as a general form of address was universal in all the liberated areas during the Civil War period. Copied after the custom of the Communist Party, which later spread to the Red Army, it eventually came into common usage throughout revolutionary society.